Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning. My name is Dr. Veronica McComb. I serve as Associate Professor of History and incoming Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences here at Lenore-Rhine University. Welcome to week 7 of COVID class. We'll be looking at pandemics then and now. To give you a little bit of context about my background, I've been at Lenore-Rhine since 2011. I am a 20th century American cultural historian specializing in immigration, race, ethnicity, and the African diaspora, with minor interests in the sociology of religion, media studies, and digital storytelling. These perspectives will very much inform the conversation that we'll have this week and will inform the comments that I have for you today. Our agenda for today is very, very simple. We have two things I would like to accomplish. First, we're going to look at some past pandemics in the 19th, 20th, and of course, bringing us up to the 21st century. And then we can compare those to what is happening right now with COVID-19. Before we begin our deep dive, I want to pause for a minute and actually take a perspective from sociology. Now, you may be wondering why a historian would want to begin with a psychology concept. And those reasons are fairly simple if you buy into Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs represented here in this pyramid. At the bottom, we have our physiological needs, which include food, shelter, water, clothing, sleep, etc., kind of those basic human needs or from day to day. Then if you move up the pyramid, you'll see right in the middle, right towards the middle, that sense of belonging. So a sense of identity, a sense of being part of a community or group, a sense of love and affection. So if you buy this, humans are essentially social creatures, largely social creatures. So whether you're self-proclaimed introvert or extrovert, on some basic level, we all need some sense of connecting with others, be it in large groups, small groups, etc. And it's that need, I argue, that is largely to blame for the current predicament that we're in right now with the pandemic, and also that past pandemics as well. According to an article from 2013 in Live Science, the human population is expected to reach 11 billion in the year 2100, which has tremendous ramifications for the spread of infectious diseases. The article's author, Bahar Ghalipur, stated that scientists, quote, are keeping an eye on new viruses that may cause the next pandemic and are trying to find new cures for pathogens that have long been present in human history but are developing resistance to available drugs. The author then listed the following 5 diseases that are most likely to be the cause of our next pandemic. They were influenza, SARS, malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV/AIDS. Talk about soothsaying. Of these diseases, COVID-19 is most closely related to SARS with some key differences. In a recent article from June of this year in the New York Times, science editor Alan Burdick stated that unlike SARS, previous SARS viruses, COVID-19, which those viruses tended to settle deeper in the respiratory system and tend to sort of lead to those deep chest coughs. COVID-19 settles in the upper respiratory system in your nose and your throat. He says that means that it tends to spread with your voice, in addition to coughs and sneezes. And when you look at where a lot of the major super spreader events have occurred, it's places like churches where folks are singing, it's meatpacking plants where people have to talk really loud, it's sports arenas, it's call centers, and I realized, holy cow, this is a virus that is ideally adapted to human conversation, end quote. So in essence, in our search to connect with one another, as that search for belonging, that need for face-to-face interaction, our need for belonging in that hierarchy of needs is essentially responsible for the spread of this particular pandemic. So what I'm asking today in this lecture is how is this different and how is this the same from past pandemics, and what can we learn about these differences and similarities in terms of how we grapple with COVID-19 here in the 21st century. To do so, I'm going to take you through 9 different pandemics. So if you're looking at this timeline to our right, we're going to begin with, at the bottom, cholera in 1817 and go all the way up to several different pandemics in the 19th and 20th century until we get to COVID-19 in our present situation. So first we have cholera in 1817, and note that this is the first of 7 cholera outbreaks that would occur over the course of the next 150 to 200 years. Cholera is an infection of the small intestines, and this particular one originated in Russia and was spread by British soldiers largely through the naval operations and through colonial activity that the British were undergoing at the time. It spread to Africa, Indonesia, China, Japan, Italy, Germany, and the United States. It's also important to note in terms of U.S. history, the U.S. was yet to be a major global power until later in the 19th century, which will have tremendous effects for how it spreads and how many infections we see in the United States. It killed 150,000 people, in the United States. A vaccine was created in 1865, but outbreaks still continued periodically. In total, this cholera pandemic killed 1 million people worldwide. Just under 40 years later, we have the spread of the third bubonic plague, or otherwise known as the Black Plague, in 1855. Again, if we're looking at U.S. history as a touchstone, this is just before the start of the U.S. Civil War. And again, we're not yet a global power, so you're not going to see a tremendous amount of infection happening in the United States because we don't have a lot of global activity at this point. So this particular pandemic started in China before it moved to India and Hong Kong. It was carried during the mining boom in Yunnan, and it had a major influence on the Taiping and Parthay rebellions in terms of the way that it spread and the kind of results of those rebellions. It was also used by the British to justify invoking really repressive policies in India, which were responded to in kind with several revolts in India during British colonization. The bubonic plague continued in these areas up until 1960, and it claimed 15 million lives in the process. About 20 years later, we see a much smaller size pandemic in terms of the number of deaths and the spread, but to me, one of the more tragic pandemics in 1875, the Fiji measles. After Fiji was ceded to the British, a royal party visited Australia to kind of celebrate their sort of conclusion of the kind of turmoil and disagreement that they were having. But they arrived in Australia during a measles outbreak, and that British royal party then brought the measles back to Fiji, and it spread throughout the island. Remember, Fiji is not a very big island and not a very huge population, so when we look at 40,000 people, those 40,000 deaths, we have to consider it in relation to the size of the population of the island. So this devastated the island with bodies being stacked upon bodies, in whole houses being used to be able to burn bodies, et cetera, et cetera. So we think about the level of devastation, even though it's only 2 countries that are at play here, Australia and Fiji. It really had a significant impact on the percentage of deaths compared to the general population. Less than 20 years later, or a little over 20 years later, so 24 years later, my math, we have a much larger range of a pandemic with the 1889 Russian flu. This strain of the flu is said to have originated in Siberia and Kazakhstan before moving on to Finland and Poland. It spread throughout Europe and parts of North America, and in the process claimed about 360,000 lives. About 30 years after the spread of the Russian flu, we have arguably one of the most remembered and known pandemics, the 1918 Spanish flu. It was first observed in Europe and North America and Asia as well, spread through activities associated with the First World War. However, it was termed the Spanish flu in large part due to censoring that was happening in all of these countries at the time. Again, we're in the middle of a major world war, the first of its kind, and many of the participants in these wars on either side really didn't want kind of mass panic to result from this uptick in flu infections, and so they really kept it on the down low, so to speak, from their various citizens. However, Spain was a neutral country, and when Spain first noted this outbreak occurring in their country, they thought that they were the only ones that were experiencing this, and they thus dubbed it the Spanish flu, and that name, of course, obviously stuck. So it's not that it originated in Spain, it's just that Spain was the first to speak out about the spread of the disease at this time. The flu continued to kill millions of people over the course of 1918 and into 1919 when it slowed during the summer, but a second wave hit and exploded between September and December of 1818. By the summer of 1919, it infected 1/3 of the world's population, with about 500 million people that were infected with the disease. Of course, some major factors of the spread included military activity, as I said, but it also included a corresponding spike in global migration and immigration to the United States. So as people were escaping war-torn areas of their country and moving elsewhere, they continued to carry the disease with them. By summer of 2019, the disease slowed by achieving herd immunity, which we heard about from Dr. Grimm's lecture in week 2 of our class. But by the end of that herd immunity point, the Spanish flu had claimed 50 million lives worldwide. About 40 years later, just under 40 years later, we have the spread of another flu pandemic called the Asian flu, which originated in Hong Kong and spread to the U.S. and England. In 6 months, it claimed 14,000 lives. In summer of 1958, a second wave hit, causing greater devastation and claiming 1.1 million lives worldwide. 16,000 of those lives, of those deaths, were in the United States. Eventually, a vaccine was developed to help stop the spread of that particular infection. About 36 or so years after the 1957 Asian flu, we see a very different pandemic. So far we've looked at cholera, the bubonic plague, several different types of influenza, and now in 1981, we have a very different type of disease that seems to devastate the world population. HIV/AIDS is a virus that has as its signature components fever, enlarged lymph nodes, and eventually really attacks the immune system and destroys the immune system, making the body highly susceptible to other diseases. Scientists and epidemiologists continue to do research on this particular disease. It's thought to have originated from a chimpanzee virus in the 1920s in West Africa. Earliest cases that were reported were traced back to Haiti in the 1960s, and then New York and San Francisco in the 1970s. The first real outbreak was observed in the gay community in the United States and mistakenly thought to only be transmitted through homosexual intercourse. It was later found that the disease was transmitted through blood as well as genital fluids, whether you were homosexual or heterosexual. Since then, we have learned a lot about the disease, but we have yet to find a cure. As of today, 2020, the disease has claimed over 35 million lives worldwide, and about 1 million of those lives in the United States. I find it rather interesting that many of my students these days don't really remember HIV/AIDS as a pandemic. They see it as a disease that is possible to be infected by through intercourse, but not something of such devastating proportions. And I think that has a lot to do with the kind of strides that we've made in terms of treating the disease, but then also the way that we remember certain types of pandemics and their impact on a large swath of the general community. Some of you may remember this next disease because it's not too long ago, 2003, and it's SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome. We spoke about it a little bit earlier in this lecture. It's believed to have been started in bats and then cats and then on to humans in China. Its sort of characteristics are dry cough, fever, headache, and body aches. In 2003, it spread to 26 other countries beyond China, infecting over 8,000 people and killing nearly 800. The disease was slowed significantly by quarantine efforts, and then China was criticized at that time for attempting to suppress information about the disease. As was said in the science articles that we talked about earlier, SARS really served as a wake-up call for a lot of epidemiologists about what could possibly happen in terms of pandemic proportions and which diseases are likely to cause them. In the end, SARS spread to, again, 26 other countries, infecting 8,000 people and then killing nearly 800. So that brings us to COVID-19. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the different sort of milestones in the disease because you've heard quite a bit about them in the previous lessons thus far. I'm going to highlight a few as they pertain to some of the other comments I want to make about pandemics in general and COVID-19 specifically as it pertains to my particular area of expertise. So COVID-19 was first reported several cases in December of 2019 in Wuhan, China. And by mid-January 2020, the first death was reported in Wuhan. At the end of January 2020, the city was put on quarantine. And by February 9th, the death toll in mainland China surpassed that of the death toll of SARS from 2003. I believe that the itinerant state of the world that we're in, through our airlines, through our cruise ships, through our, again, just being able to be much more mobile and different types of mobility, the disease is able to spread much, much more quickly and before we're able to detect it, especially with the disease path of COVID-19. And therefore, that's why we're seeing this sort of pandemic size proportion so quickly in such a short amount of time. As of the time of the recording of this lecture, June 29th, 2020, the global infection rate of COVID-19 has reached over 9.5 million. The global death rate is over 500,000. The number of infections, positive tests have reached over 250,000. Well over 250,000, excuse me, more decimal points, 2.5 million people. And the number of death rates is currently at 388,000 people have died in the United States alone from COVID-19. I deliberately left this slide blank in terms of the numbers because, as we have talked about, the rate of spread for this infection changes every day. And we have hundreds of thousands of people being affected every day, both in the United States and globally. So to say that these numbers are fixed at, let's say, a week ago would be very different 1 week later. Within those numbers that we were just talking about, there have been a disproportionate number of women and people of color affected by COVID-19. People of color, especially African Americans, have a higher rate of comorbidity traits such as heart disease and diabetes that put them at a higher risk for contracting the disease and possibly dying from the disease. Women and people of color also are employed at higher rates in what we have termed essential jobs during both the stay-at-home orders and the phase 1 and phase 2 of reopening our businesses. So just to give you a quick snapshot, of the different pandemics at a glance, I put these in order of number of deaths globally. So as you can see, Spanish flu tops this list at 50 million people worldwide. And then right at about 5 or 6 down, we have the number of deaths from COVID-19. Of course, that number is different from when I created this chart. As I just said, it's 388,000 people have died from COVID-19. And I believe this chart was created, I think, about a week ago. So again, making sure you see that difference in such a short amount of time. So the good news is that this is not the worst that the human population has endured. And of course, the bad news is it's not over yet. And to see from a historical perspective where COVID-19 will lay in the kind of the chronology of different pandemics, global pandemics, is going to be really, really interesting to observe. And just to shift gears a tiny bit to talk about what happens in terms of the dynamics within the United States with these different infectious diseases, Alan Cruat wrote a fabulous book called Silent Travelers, and actually you have a couple of readings for this week by Cruat. He is an immigration expert that also looks at the correlation between immigration activity and infectious diseases. In his book Silent Travelers, he chronicles smallpox and various other infectious diseases and the ways in which the United States responded to newcomers or immigrants. So, of course, with smallpox, we're looking at immigration from a very different perspective, whereas the European explorers are the newcomers to the New World and bringing with them smallpox, which effectively devastates the Native American population. And then we have in the 19th and 20th century, the Chicken outbreak of the bubonic plague in California, and then Typhoid Mary, which many of you have probably heard of, an outbreak of typhoid fever in New York City. And what effectively happens in each one of these pandemics, the Jewish pandemic and New York again of tuberculosis, the United States begins to kind of categorize specific immigrant populations as carrying as inherently carrying these diseases or are carriers of these diseases. This is, in fact, is sadly no different from what the rhetoric that President Trump has been promoting about COVID-19, referring to it as the Kung flu or the Chinese disease. And what we do to our citizens when we make these kind of labels is that we create this very distinct other in which people are very wary of interacting with anyone from this particular ethnicity at all, which of course infringes upon their freedoms in terms of being able to freely move about the United States in ways that we all should benefit from as free citizens of this country. In the article that I posted for this week, Ruet has this fabulous quote about this very phenomenon, and he says, quote, "Xenophobia during an epidemic or pandemic in this case, then can be framed as a social ritual that reaffirms a hypernationalism in the native born, one that seeks to justify pre-existing racial and religious prejudices directed towards those defined as quote-unquote other. However, when the drama that is an epidemic concludes and the curtain descends, the prejudice and acts of discrimination do not vanish. They merely transfer to a different stage." I thought that was pretty powerful. So what have we learned in the past 20 minutes or so? And hopefully you can see this okay. COVID-19 is climbing up the list of cataclysmic pandemic events, as we talked about. Race, gender, and ethnicity impact lots of different Americans disproportionately, depending upon what your race is, what your gender is, what your ethnicity is, you might be at a higher risk for infection. The xenophobic responses from the United States and are consistent with public responses from past pandemic events and epidemic events, causing stigmatization of those groups that are associated with those infections. So in conclusion, whether you're looking at us as humans as social creatures and our need to connect with one another, I just beg each one of you, if we're looking at this as a retrospective and lessons learned, that we really need to be kind to one another, but at the same time keep our distance, wash our hands, good hygiene is important, and please, if you're going to talk, if you need to belong and you need to talk with somebody face to face, wear a mask, please. That's all from me. I look forward to connecting with you, live on Thursday. And thank you very much for tuning in.